Black man inherits floating houseboat, then discovers what's hidden below deck. Malcolm Rivers stared at the rusty keys in his palm, their weight somehow heavier than their size suggested. The humid Louisiana air clung to his skin as he stood on the weathered dock, watching the houseboat bob lazily in the murky water of Bayou Lafourche. Driftwood Grace was painted in faded blue letters across the stern, though the paint had peeled so badly that only fragments of each letter remained visible. "You sure you want to go in there alone?" asked Mrs. Thibodeau, the elderly marina manager who had handed him the keys. Her weathered face showed genuine concern. "That boat's been sitting here for 3 months since your grandfather passed. Nobody set foot on her except the deputies when they came looking for next of kin." Malcolm nodded, though his stomach churned with uncertainty. "I need to see what I'm dealing with before I decide anything." He had barely known Clifton Rivers. Growing up, his grandfather had been more legend than family, a man who appeared at holidays with strange gifts and stranger stories, then vanished back into the bayou for months at a time. Malcolm's mother always said Clifton was touched, spending more time talking to the water than to people. When the call came 3 weeks ago about the inheritance, Malcolm had expected maybe an old fishing rod or a box of photographs. Not this floating museum of neglect. The gangplank groaned under his feet as he stepped aboard. The deck was littered with dead leaves and what looked like years of accumulated debris. A broken chair lay on its side near the bow, and fishing nets hung from the railings like Spanish moss, torn and rotting in the humid air. But as Malcolm's hand touched the cabin door handle, something strange happened. The feeling that had been gnawing at him all morning, that sense of anxious unfamiliarity, suddenly shifted. His fingers seemed to know exactly how much pressure to apply to the stubborn latch. The door swung open with a long, mournful creak, and the musty smell that wafted out wasn't just old wood and stagnant water. There was something else, something that triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. Pipe tobacco, old books, and something else. The interior was darker than he'd expected. Heavy curtains blocked most of the windows, and what little light filtered through revealed a space frozen in time. A small kitchen occupied one corner, its counter still holding dishes that hadn't been washed in months. A narrow table was covered with nautical charts, their edges curled and yellow with age. And everywhere, on shelves, hanging from hooks scattered across surfaces, were the remnants of a life lived entirely on water. Malcolm moved carefully through the space, his teacher's instincts automatically cataloging details. This wasn't just a houseboat, it was an archive. Every surface told a story. Hand-carved fishing lures hung from the ceiling in neat rows, each one different, each one clearly made with meticulous care. Photographs covered one entire wall, but they weren't typical family snapshots. They showed the bayou from dozens of different angles, in different seasons, different weather. Some were clearly decades old, judging by the faded color and the clothes worn by the occasional person in frame. But it was the books that surprised him most. Stacks of them everywhere, not the hunting and fishing magazines he'd expected, but real books. History books. Legal texts. Survey manuals. And all of them bookmarked, annotated, filled with handwritten notes in his grandfather's careful script. Malcolm picked up one of the legal texts, its spine cracked from use. The pages fell open to a section on property rights and water boundaries. Nearly every line was highlighted or underlined. In the margin, Clifton had written, "They think the water washes away memory. They're wrong." A chill ran down Malcolm's spine that had nothing to do with the boat's musty interior. He set the book down and continued exploring. The bedroom was small but tidy, the bed made with military precision. More photographs here, these ones clearly older. Black and white images of people Malcolm didn't recognize, standing in front of simple wooden buildings. One photo showed a family, a man, woman, and 3 children, posed in front of what looked like a small house on stilts. The woman held a baby, and everyone was smiling despite their obviously humble circumstances. On the nightstand beside the bed, Malcolm found something that made his breath catch. It was a small, leather-bound journal, and tucked inside the front cover was a folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully, afraid the old paper might crumble in his hands. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon on what looked like brown paper from a grocery bag. The drawing showed a house on the water, with a little boy standing on a dock. At the bottom, in a child's careful handwriting, "Me and Grandpapa's House," by Malcolm Rivers. Age 7. Malcolm stared at the drawing, his mind racing. He had no memory of creating this, no memory of ever being on his grandfather's boat as a child. But the handwriting was unmistakably his. He recognized the way he'd always made his M's, with the middle peaks slightly off-center. He sank onto the edge of the bed, still holding the drawing. How could he have forgotten something like this? And if he'd been here before, why did the boat feel both familiar and foreign at the same time? Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows, casting long shadows across the cluttered interior. Malcolm looked around with new eyes, trying to imagine himself here as a 7-year-old. Had he sat at that little table? Had he helped his grandfather with those fishing nets? And then, like a whisper from the past, he heard his grandfather's voice in his memory. "You see that land over there, boy? Past the marsh grass, where the fancy boats are moored? That used to be something else entirely. The land the river swallowed, we called it. But rivers don't swallow everything. Some things, they just hide until the right time comes to give them back." Malcolm's hands began to shake as the memory crystallized. He had been here before. Many times. And his grandfather had told him stories, not the rambling tales of an eccentric old man, but careful lessons disguised as entertainment. Stories about land that had been lost, about families that had been scattered, about things that should never be signed away. He stood up abruptly, the drawing still clutched in his hand. If he'd forgotten so much, what else had his grandfather tried to tell him? What else had he hidden in plain sight? The floorboards creaked under his feet as he moved back toward the main cabin, but now the sound was different. Not just the settling of old wood, but something more purposeful. As if the boat itself was trying to tell him something. Malcolm knelt down and pressed his palm against the floor. The boards here were different from the others, newer though still aged. And when he looked closely, he could see that some of the nails didn't quite match the patina of the others. His grandfather had been trying to preserve something. The question was, what? As the sun began to set over the bayou, casting the interior of driftwood grace in deep amber light, Malcolm Rivers realized that inheriting this boat was not the end of his grandfather's story. It was the beginning of his own. 3 days later, Malcolm returned to the houseboat with cleaning supplies and a stubborn determination. He'd spent the weekend researching boat restoration online, watching YouTube videos about marine wood treatment, and trying to convince himself that fixing up driftwood grace was a practical investment rather than an emotional impulse. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He couldn't stop thinking about that drawing. Armed with rubber gloves, a bucket, and industrial-strength cleaner, Malcolm began the tedious process of sorting through decades of accumulated belongings. Every item seemed to tell a story. A hand-carved duck decoy with initials CR 1967 carved into its base, a compass whose brass surface had been polished smooth by countless fingers, a collection of mason jars filled with different types of sand, each labeled with locations Malcolm didn't recognize. But it was the floor that kept drawing his attention. Those mismatched boards near the kitchen area seemed to pulse with possibility every time he looked at them. By noon, Malcolm had filled 3 garbage bags with items beyond saving: moldy magazines, rusted tools, clothing that had become a breeding ground for insects. The boat was beginning to look less like an abandoned relic and more like a place where someone had actually lived. He was scrubbing the kitchen counter when his elbow knocked over a jar of rusty screws. They scattered across the floor with metallic pings, rolling into corners and under furniture. Malcolm sighed and got down on his hands and knees to collect them. That's when he noticed it. One of the floorboards near the stove had a gap along its edge, not the natural separation of aged wood, but a clean line, as if the board had been deliberately cut and fitted back into place. Malcolm pressed down on it experimentally, and it gave slightly under pressure, like a loose tooth. His heart began to race. He looked around for something to pry with, and found an old butter knife in one of the kitchen drawers. The blade slid easily into the gap along the board's edge. With careful pressure, Malcolm worked the knife around the perimeter until the entire plank began to lift. The wood was more rotted than it appeared. When Malcolm finally got a good grip and pulled, the board came up with a soft, wet crack, revealing a rectangular cavity beneath. And inside that cavity was a tin box. Malcolm's hands trembled as he lifted it out. The box was old but well preserved, wrapped in what looked like several layers of plastic bags. His grandfather had been meticulous about protecting whatever was inside from the humid bayou air. He carried the box to the small table and carefully unwrapped it. Inside, he found 3 items that would change everything he thought he knew about his family. The first was a hand-drawn map on heavy paper, yellow with age but remarkably detailed. At the top, someone had written, "Property Survey Rivers Family Land," in careful block letters. Below that, a date. March 15, 1956. The map showed what appeared to be a section of marshland, complete with elevation markers, boundary lines, and compass directions. Strange symbols were scattered across the mapped area. Some looked like buildings, others like trees or waterways. But what made Malcolm's breath catch was the signature at the bottom right corner. Clifton Rivers, Surveyor, in the same handwriting he'd seen throughout the boat. The second item was a photograph, faded but clearly showing a family of 5 standing in front of a small house built on stilts over water. Malcolm recognized the woman from other photos he'd seen, his great-grandmother, though she looked much younger here. The man beside her had Clifton's eyes and jawline. And the 3 children. Malcolm held the photo closer to the window. The smallest child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 8, looked exactly like Malcolm had at that age. Written on the back in pencil, "The Rivers Place, 1955. Before the water came." The third item was a folded piece of paper, brittle with age. Malcolm opened it carefully, afraid it might fall apart in his hands. It was a handwritten note in his grandfather's familiar script. "Malcolm, if you're reading this, then you've come back to where you belong. This land has been ours for more than a century, but they tried to wash us away with paper and legal words. The flood of '58 scattered our family, but it didn't wash away our rights. Everything you need to know is in this box and in the places I've marked on this boat. Don't let them bury what's rightfully ours. The land remembers even when people forget. It's still ours. Don't let them bury it. Your grandfather, Clifton Rivers." Malcolm read the note 3 times before its full meaning began to sink in. His grandfather hadn't just been an eccentric old man living on a houseboat. He'd been a guardian, protecting something that legally belonged to their family. But protecting it from what? Malcolm spread the map out on the table and studied it more carefully. The property boundaries were clearly marked, and there were coordinates written in the margins. On impulse, he pulled out his phone and opened the GPS app, entering the coordinates from the map. The location that appeared on his screen made his stomach drop. According to his phone, the coordinates pointed to an area currently occupied by Bellwater Marina, one of the most expensive boating communities in southern Louisiana. Malcolm had driven past it dozens of times, admiring the pristine docks and luxury yachts from the road. But according to this map, that land belonged to his family. Malcolm grabbed his laptop from his bag and spent the next 2 hours cross-referencing property records, satellite images, and historical documents. The more he researched, the more questions arose. Bellwater Marina sat on land that had indeed been marshland until the late 1950s. The area had been developed gradually over several decades, transforming from wetland to upscale marina through a series of drainage and landfill projects. But nowhere in the public records could Malcolm find any mention of the Rivers family, or their claim to the original land. As afternoon faded into evening, Malcolm sat surrounded by printouts and documents, his grandfather's map spread out before him like a treasure chart. The implications were staggering. If this map was accurate, if the property claims were legitimate, then his family had been robbed of valuable land for more than 60 years. And his grandfather had spent his entire life trying to prove it. Malcolm looked around the houseboat with new understanding. This wasn't just Clifton's home. It was his archive, his research station, his proof that some things should never be signed away. The question now was, what was Malcolm going to do about it? Malcolm's hands shook as he dialed his Aunt Loretta's number. If anyone knew the truth about the family's past, it would be her. Loretta was Clifton's younger sister, the keeper of family stories, and the only person who still talked about the old days, without changing the subject. "Baby, what's got you calling me at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night?" Loretta's warm voice carried through the phone, immediately soothing Malcolm's nerves. "You sound like you've seen a ghost. Aunt Loretta, I need to ask you about Grandpa Clifton. About the land. About what happened before I was born." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Loretta spoke again, her voice had changed, softer, sadder, weighted with years of carefully buried memories. "Lord have mercy. You found something on that boat, didn't you?" "I found a map. And a photograph of a house I don't remember." "Aunt Loretta, did our family really own land where that fancy marina is now?" Another pause. Malcolm could hear Loretta moving around, the sound of a chair creaking as she sat down heavily. "Baby, you need to come see me. Tonight. Some stories are too big for phone calls." An hour later, Malcolm sat in Loretta's small kitchen, the map and photographs spread out on her yellow formica table. His aunt, now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, stared at the items with tears streaming down her cheeks. "I haven't seen this picture in 50 years, she whispered, touching the photograph gently. "That's Mama and Daddy. And look at Clifton there. He couldn't have been more than 12. We were all so young." She picked up the map and examined it closely. "Clifton drew this himself. He was always good with measurements, good with details. Even as a boy, he could look at a piece of land and tell you exactly how big it was, where the water would flow, what would grow where. But what happened to the land? Why don't I remember any of this?" Loretta set the map down and walked to her refrigerator, returning with a pitcher of sweet tea. She poured 2 glasses with the automatic motions of someone buying time to organize painful memories. "Your great-grandfather, Samuel Rivers, bought that land in 1911. 47 acres of marshland, right where the Lafourche River spreads out into the Gulf. It wasn't much to look at then, mostly water and grass, but Samuel had vision. He built that house you see in the picture, raised his family there. We caught fish, trapped muskrat, lived off what the land gave us." She sat back down and took a long sip of tea. "The land was everything to us, baby. It was our home, our livelihood, our legacy. Your great-grandfather always said the land would take care of the family, and the family would take care of the land. So what changed? Hurricane Audrey, 1957. You probably never heard of it. It wasn't as famous as Katrina, but it was devastating. The storm's surge pushed water inland for miles, flooded everything. Our house was damaged, but we could have rebuilt. We'd survived hurricanes before." Loretta's voice grew bitter. "But then came the vultures. Development companies, officials, insurance adjusters. They said the land was unsuitable for habitation, that it would flood again, that we'd be better off somewhere else. They offered us money, not much, but more than our daddy had ever seen at one time. And the family took it? Most of us did. Your great-grandfather was getting old, and the younger folks wanted to start fresh somewhere that didn't flood. But Clifton..." She shook her head. "Clifton was different. He was 18 then, old enough to have his own opinions. He said the land was worth more than they were offering, that they were trying to steal it from us." Malcolm leaned forward. "Was he right? Baby, within 5 years, that whole area was drained and developed. First it was just a small boat launch, then a marina, then fancy houses, and now, well, you've seen Bellwater Marina. $1 million boats, expensive restaurants, luxury condos. All built on land that used to be ours." The implications hit Malcolm like a physical blow. How much would it be worth now? Tens of millions, at least. Maybe more. Loretta reached across the table and took his hand. "But here's the thing nobody talks about. Clifton never signed the papers." Malcolm's heart stopped. "What?" "When the family decided to sell, Clifton refused. He was 18, legally an adult, and he owned his share of the property through your great-grandfather's will. The development company needed all the heirs to sign off on the sale. When Clifton wouldn't budge, they got creative. "What do you mean?" Loretta stood up and walked to an old wooden cabinet, returning with a manila folder yellowed with age. "I've been keeping these for 60 years, waiting for someone in the family to ask the right questions." She opened the folder and pulled out several documents. They declared Clifton mentally incompetent to make legal decisions. Said he was traumatized by the hurricane, that he wasn't thinking clearly. They had a judge sign papers making the parish the guardian of his portion of the land. Malcolm's blood ran cold. That's illegal. It was then too, baby. But Clifton was 18, black, and poor. Who was going to fight for him? The rest of the family had already taken their money and moved on. Clifton tried to contest it, but he didn't have lawyers or connections or influence. So they just stole his land? They buried it in legal paperwork. Made it disappear. But Clifton never forgot, and he never gave up. He spent the rest of his life researching, documenting, keeping records. Loretta gestured toward the map. He always said someday the truth would come out. Someday someone in the family would have the education and the resources to fight back. Malcolm stared at the documents spread across the table, his mind racing with possibilities and implications. "And Loretta, do you think he was right? Do you think the land still legally belongs to our family?" His aunt smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "Baby, your grandfather was a lot of things, but he wasn't crazy. If Clifton said that land was still ours, then it's still ours. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" As Malcolm drove home through the dark Louisiana night, his grandfather's words echoed in his memory. Some things should never be signed away. Now he understood. Clifton hadn't been living on that houseboat because he was eccentric. He'd been living there because he was waiting. Malcolm returned to Driftwood Grace the next morning with a new sense of purpose. If his grandfather had spent decades collecting evidence, then there had to be more hidden somewhere on the boat. The tin box under the floorboards was just the beginning. He started in the bedroom, methodically examining every piece of furniture, every photograph, every book. Clifton had been meticulous about organization. Malcolm was beginning to understand that nothing on this boat was random or accidental. It was while examining the built-in dresser that Malcolm noticed something odd. The bottom drawer was shallower than the others, as if there was a false bottom. He pulled it out completely, and ran his hands along the interior. Sure enough, there was a seam in the wood that suggested a hidden compartment. It took him 20 minutes to figure out the mechanism, a small wooden peg that could be pushed to release a spring-loaded panel. When it clicked open, Malcolm found himself looking at a watertight metal container, the kind used for important documents on boats. Inside were papers that would change his life forever. The first document was an original deed, its edges brown with age, but the text still clearly legible. Property deed Parish of Lafourche, State of Louisiana. Dated August 12, 1911. The buyer was listed as Samuel Rivers, Malcolm's great-grandfather. The seller was the Louisiana Land Company. The property description matched exactly with the coordinates on Clifton's hand-drawn map. But it was the second document that made Malcolm's hands shake. It was a lease agreement, dated March 3, 1958, just months after Hurricane Audrey. The document showed that the land had been leased, not sold, to Gulf Coast Development Corporation for drainage and land reclamation purposes. The lease term was clearly stated, 25 years, with an option to renew only with the consent of all property owners. Malcolm did the math quickly in his head. 25 years from 1958 would be 1983. The lease had expired more than 40 years ago. But there was more. Attached to the lease was a letter from Gulf Coast Development Corporation, dated January 15, 1983, requesting renewal of the lease agreement. The letter was addressed to the estate of Samuel Rivers, and copied to Clifton Rivers, legal heir. And clipped to that letter was Clifton's response, handwritten on lined notebook paper. Lease renewal denied. Please arrange for return of property to original condition per terms of original agreement. Clifton Rivers, February 2, 1983. Malcolm sank onto the edge of the bed, his mind reeling. His grandfather hadn't just been collecting documents, he'd been conducting legal business. He'd formally denied the lease renewal 32 years ago. Which meant that for more than 3 decades, Bellwater Marina had been operating on land they had no legal right to occupy. Malcolm pulled out his phone and called the only lawyer he knew, Joyce Melankin, who'd handled his mother's estate 2 years earlier. Joyce specialized in family law, not property disputes, but she'd always told him to call if he needed legal advice about anything. "Malcolm, honey, what's got you calling so early?" Joyce's voice was warm but professional. "Joyce, I need to ask you about property law. If someone has been occupying land without a valid lease or deed, what are the legal implications?" "Well, that depends on a lot of factors. How long have they been there? Was there ever a valid agreement? Are we talking about adverse possession or trespassing?" Malcolm took a deep breath. "What if I told you that a major marina has been operating on my family's land without permission for 40 years, and I have documents to prove it?" There was a long pause. "Malcolm, I think you'd better come see me. Today. And bring everything you've got." 2 hours later, Malcolm sat in Joyce's office, watching the lawyer's expression change as she examined each document. Joyce was in her 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd built her practice on helping families navigate complex legal situations, and Malcolm could see her mind working as she processed the implications of what he'd brought her. "This is remarkable," she said finally, setting down the lease agreement. "If these documents are authentic, and they appear to be, then you have a legitimate claim to property worth, well, let's just say it's significant." "How significant?" Joyce pulled up satellite images of Bellwater Marina on her computer. "The marina alone probably generates several $1 million in revenue annually. The property underneath it is prime waterfront real estate. We're talking about a potential claim worth tens of millions of dollars." Malcolm felt dizzy. "But they can't just have been operating illegally all this time. Someone would have noticed. You'd be surprised how often these situations occur, especially when the original landowners were poor or marginalized. Companies count on people not having the resources or knowledge to fight back." Joyce tapped the papers with her pen. "Your grandfather was clearly more sophisticated than they expected. So what do I do now?" Joyce leaned back in her chair, studying Malcolm carefully. "That depends on what you want to achieve. We could file a lawsuit demanding immediate return of the property, but that would likely tie this up in court for years. We could demand back rent for the past 40 years of illegal occupation. Or what? Or we could approach them directly and see if they're interested in negotiating a fair settlement. Sometimes the threat of a lawsuit is more effective than actually filing one, especially when you have documentation this solid." Malcolm looked at the papers spread across Joyce's desk. His grandfather's life work, decades of careful research and patient waiting. "What would Clifton want me to do?" "I think," Joyce said gently, "your grandfather would want you to make the decision that's best for you and your family. He preserved your options. Now you get to choose which one to exercise." As Malcolm left Joyce's office that afternoon, he felt the weight of history on his shoulders. In his bag were photocopies of documents that could change his life, could provide financial security he never imagined possible. But they also represented something more, vindication for a man who'd spent his entire life fighting to preserve his family's legacy. The question now wasn't whether Malcolm had a case. The question was what kind of man he wanted to be, and what kind of legacy he wanted to leave for the next generation. His grandfather had been patient for 60 years. Malcolm wondered if he had inherited that patience, or if it was time to act. Word traveled fast in small Louisiana communities. 3 days after Malcolm's meeting with Joyce, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Rivers? This is David Castellanos, legal counsel for Bellwater Marina. I understand you've been asking questions about property ownership in our area. I'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss this matter." Malcolm's stomach dropped. He hadn't told anyone outside of Joyce and Aunt Loretta about his discovery. "How did you?" "Mr. Rivers, legal research leaves paper trails. My clients are naturally concerned when someone begins investigating property claims that could affect their business operations. Could we meet tomorrow? I think you'll find our offer quite generous. Offer? We believe in resolving these matters amicably. Shall we say 2 o'clock at the Marina office? Malcolm arrived at Bellwater Marina the next afternoon feeling like David facing Goliath. The pristine facility was even more impressive up close. Gleaming white docks stretched out into the bayou like fingers, accommodating dozens of expensive boats. The clubhouse was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all glass and steel and perfectly manicured landscaping. David Castellanos was exactly what Malcolm had expected. Mid-50s, expensive suit, the kind of confident smile that suggested he was used to getting his way. He was accompanied by a woman introduced as Margaret Chin, the marina's general manager. Mr. Rivers, thank you for coming. I've reviewed the documents your attorneys shared with us. Castellanos gestured to a leather folder on the conference table. I have to say, your grandfather was quite thorough in his record-keeping. So you acknowledge that my family owns this land? The legal situation is complex. There are competing claims, statute of limitations issues, questions about the validity of certain documents. Castellanos opened the folder. However, my clients prefer to avoid prolonged litigation. They're prepared to offer you a settlement of $500,000 for any potential claims to this property. Malcolm's heart hammered in his chest. $500,000 was more money than he'd ever imagined having. It would pay off his student loans, his mother's medical debt, allow him to buy a house, maybe even take a sabbatical from teaching to pursue his master's degree. That's a substantial offer, Malcolm managed. It is indeed. And it comes with no legal fees, no years of uncertainty, no risk of losing everything in court. Castellanos slid a document across the table. This is a standard release agreement. You sign it, we cut you a check, and everyone moves forward with their lives. Margaret Chin leaned forward. Mr. Rivers, I hope you understand that this offer reflects our desire to be good neighbors, not any admission of legal obligation. We've invested tens of millions of dollars in this facility over the past decade. We employ 47 people. We contribute significantly to the local tax base. The subtext was clear. Taking legal action wouldn't just hurt the marina, it would hurt the entire community. Malcolm stared at the papers, his mind racing. $500,000. It was a life-changing sum. But something nagged at him, something Joyce had said about the property being worth tens of millions. I need time to think about this. Of course. But I should mention that this offer has an expiration date. Castellanos glanced at his watch. We need a decision by Friday. After that, we'll be forced to take a more defensive posture. The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. That evening, Malcolm returned to Driftwood Grace feeling overwhelmed and confused. $500,000 was more than he'd ever dreamed of, but it also felt wrong somehow, like accepting charity instead of claiming what was rightfully his. He wandered through the boat aimlessly, looking for guidance that his grandfather could no longer provide. It was while sitting at the small captain's table that he noticed something he'd missed before. One of the drawers had a tiny brass key in its lock. Inside the drawer, Malcolm found items that painted a picture of his grandfather's final years. Reading glasses with arms held together by electrical tape. A small notebook filled with calculations and legal notes. A few photographs of the family, including one of Malcolm at his college graduation that he'd never seen before. And at the bottom of the drawer, a small cassette tape with a label in Clifton's handwriting. For Malcolm, play When the Vultures Come Calling. Malcolm stared at the tape for a long moment. He hadn't seen an actual cassette in years, but after some searching, he found an old portable player in one of the boat's storage compartments. He inserted the tape with trembling fingers and pressed play. His grandfather's voice filled the small cabin, raspier than Malcolm remembered but unmistakably strong. If you're listening to this, boy, then they've found out about the documents. They'll come with money first, always do. Probably more money than you've ever seen, more than you think you deserve. They'll make it sound generous, like they're doing you a favor. Malcolm's breath caught. It was as if Clifton had predicted exactly what would happen. But here's what they won't tell you, son. That money they're offering? It's a fraction of what the land is actually worth. They're not being generous, they're being practical. They know that if this goes to court, if the truth comes out, they'll lose everything. The tape crackled with static for a moment before Clifton's voice continued. They'll try to scare you too. Talk about legal fees, about uncertainty, about how you might lose everything. But Malcolm, you can't lose what's already yours. And you can't be afraid of fighting for what's right just because the fight might be hard. Malcolm closed his eyes, feeling his grandfather's presence in the small cabin. I spent 60 years waiting for someone in our family to have the education, the resources, and the courage to reclaim what was stolen from us. I'm counting on you, boy. Not because I want revenge, but because some things are bigger than money. Some fights are about more than winning, they're about who you choose to be. The tape was quiet for a long moment, then Clifton's voice returned, softer now. They'll try to buy your silence, boy. But if you hold on, this land will speak for you. Just wait until they need you more than you need them. The truth has been patient this long. It can wait a little longer. The tape clicked off, leaving Malcolm alone with his thoughts and the weight of his grandfather's expectations. Outside, the bayou was settling into evening quiet. Somewhere across the water, the lights of Bellwater Marina twinkled like stars, beautiful and expensive and built on land that should never have been signed away. Malcolm looked at his phone, thinking about the number David Castellanos had given him. $500,000 was a lot of money. But his grandfather's voice was worth more than money. And Malcolm was beginning to understand the difference. Friday morning arrived gray and humid, with storm clouds gathering over the bayou. Malcolm sat in Joyce's office, the unsigned settlement agreement on the desk between them. At noon, he was supposed to call David Castellanos with his decision. I've been thinking about what you said, Malcolm told Joyce. About approaching them instead of them approaching me. What would that look like? Joyce smiled. It would look like us taking control of the narrative. Instead of responding to their offer, we make our own proposal. What kind of proposal? Well, that depends on what you actually want to achieve. Do you want the land back? Do you want money? Do you want to make a statement? Malcolm thought about his grandfather's voice on that cassette tape, about Aunt Loretta's tears over the old photograph, about the children in his middle school classes who would never have the opportunities that money could provide. I want all of it, he said finally. But not the way they're offering it. At exactly noon, Malcolm called David Castellanos. Mr. Rivers, I hope you're calling with good news. I'm calling with a counteroffer, Mr. Castellanos. I'm not interested in selling my family's land. There was a pause. I see. Well, as I mentioned, our defensive posture. I'm not finished. I'm not interested in selling, but I am interested in a partnership. What kind of partnership? The kind where I retain full ownership of the property, and Bellwater Marina becomes my tenant. With a fair lease agreement. Joyce Melankin will be sending you the details within the hour. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Malcolm wondered if the call had dropped. Mr. Rivers, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the legal complexities. No misunderstanding. My family owns the land. Your marina has been operating on it without a valid lease for over 40 years. You can either negotiate a fair agreement with me, or you can explain to your investors why you're facing a lawsuit that could shut down the entire operation. Malcolm hung up before Castellanos could respond. 3 weeks later, Malcolm stood on the dock at what was now officially called Rivers Landing at Bellwater Marina. The negotiation had been intense but surprisingly quick once both sides accepted the reality of the situation. Bellwater Marina would pay Malcolm a percentage of their gross revenue as rent, enough to provide him with substantial annual income while allowing the marina to continue operating profitably. But more importantly to Malcolm, the agreement included provisions that honored his grandfather's memory and his own values. A section of the waterfront had been designated as public space, accessible to anyone regardless of economic status. And anchored at the prime slip, fully restored and gleaming in the afternoon sun, was Driftwood Grace. Mr. Rivers? A voice called from behind him. Malcolm turned to see a group of children from the local elementary school, their teacher herding them toward the educational pavilion that had been built as part of the settlement agreement. "Are you really going to teach us about the bayou?" asked a little girl with pigtails and gap-toothed smile. "Every Saturday morning," Malcolm confirmed. "We're going to learn about tides and fish, and how to read maps, and why it's important to know where you come from." The children cheered and ran toward the pavilion, where Malcolm had set up displays showing the history of the area, including photographs of the original Rivers family settlement, and the hand-drawn maps his grandfather had preserved. As the children gathered around the exhibits, Malcolm felt a presence beside him. He turned to see Aunt Loretta, now 83 but still sharp, watching her grandnephew with obvious pride. "Clifton would be so proud," she said softly. "You didn't just get the land back, you made it mean something." Malcolm nodded, thinking about the cassette tape that now sat in a place of honor in his apartment, next to his grandfather's compass and the original family photograph. "He was right about waiting until they needed me more than I needed them. Once they realized I wasn't going away, once they understood the legal exposure they faced, everything changed." "And the money?" Malcolm smiled. "The money is good. Better than good. But this..." He gestured toward the children exploring the exhibits, toward the public dock where families who couldn't afford marina fees could bring their small boats, toward the educational center that would serve the community for generations. "This is what the money can buy. This is what the land was always supposed to provide." A young boy approached Malcolm, holding one of Clifton's survey maps. "Mr. Rivers, how did your grandfather know to save all this stuff?" Malcolm knelt down to the child's level, seeing his own face at that age reflected in the boy's curious eyes. "Because he understood something important. He knew that some things are worth more than money. Some fights are worth having even when they're hard. And some people will try to take away what belongs to you, but if you're patient and smart and brave enough to stand up for what's right." "What happens then?" Malcolm looked out over the water, where the late afternoon sun was painting the bayou in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, expensive yachts bobbed peacefully at their slips, their owners paying rent to a middle school teacher whose grandfather had refused to let go of a dream. "Then the land remembers who it really belongs to," Malcolm said. "And it finds a way to come home." As evening settled over the bayou, Malcolm sat in the captain's chair aboard Driftwood Grace, watching his students' families arrive for the weekly community barbecue. The boat that had once been a floating archive was now the centerpiece of an educational program that would teach dozens of children every year about their heritage, their environment, and their rights. His grandfather had been patient for 60 years, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right opportunity to reclaim what had been stolen. Malcolm Rivers, middle school teacher and reluctant landowner, had inherited more than property. He had inherited the power to make sure that some things, once lost, could be found again. And that some stories, no matter how long they waited in the dark, would eventually find their way back to the light.